Good morning, everyone. And Ron was right. It is full here for 8-something a.m. So great to see you. I'm Michelle Noyes, Head of Americas for the Alternative Investment Management Association, and I'm thrilled to be your guide today to the public markets track. We have so many great speakers ahead, from market-making investors to internet-breaking influencers. So let's get started. To begin today's proceedings, I'm delighted to introduce a conversation between Peter Zion of Zion on Geopolitics and Daniel Belak, partner at Constellar, moderated by Mary Childs of NPR's Planet Money. Please welcome them to the stage. Get all of our chairs ready, warm up the fire. Can we have live fire on stage? We'll find out. Thanks so much, Mary.
Hi there. Well, it's bright.
It's bright. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. So excited to be here. Thrilled to get to be up here with the two of you. This is going to be a really great discussion about topics that we all really care about and need to hear y'all's perspectives on. So I would like to start with you, Daniel. You were just in Ukraine on Friday. What is the situation like on the ground there? Can you tell us what's going on?
Thanks very much, Mary, and it's a great pleasure to be here. It's a long way to get here these days. I'll never complain about the lines at passport control in Kiev Airport when it reopens again. It's a difficult situation right now, as it has been throughout. We're advancing in some areas and we're in a stalemate in others. A lot of it has to do with the fact that we were advancing before, but they've now thrown masses of people, most of them prisoners, that they've emptied their prisons out at our troops that have slowed us down. But you know, throughout this war, throughout this battle, I mean, it's amazing that we are even where we are today. We weren't supposed to be here. Right. And you know, all the predictions that 3 days and they're going to roll Kiev, in a week and 3 weeks they're going to take all of Ukraine. And to an enormous extent, that's because of the fact that Ukrainians are resistant, they're resilient, and they're resolute. And we have this concept of total resistance, and it comes from the fact that the entire country is at war. And I joined the territorial. I live in Kiev. I've been living in Ukraine for 30 years. I'm a Canadian. I joined the Territorial Defense Forces even before the war started. I was one of the few people that actually thought there was going to be a war. And I've been absolutely amazed at how society has come together to support not just the Army, but the Army supporting society. Mm-hmm. And it's been absolutely critical that this massive volunteer force that we have in the country has come together. Had we not had that very early on, we probably would have lost Kiev, because our Army didn't have the logistic supply lines. I mean, I'm in the Territorial Defense Forces, which is kind of like the reserve of the Army, but in a wartime situation, you get pushed to the front line. And my battalion didn't have helmets, didn't have body armor. There are people like me, like you, that are just called up and are serving to save their country. And I really would like to thank the people in this audience, and especially Ron Biscardi and Sarah Finley, who connected me with you folks. And you know, the allocators gave their time, and I think you raised over $150,000 that I was able to go and buy helmets and body armor and some basic essentials just to equip myself and my colleagues. And I'm eternally grateful to all of you. You saved a lot of lives. I just want you to know that. Plus the humanitarian aspect of it as well. So, I mean, you know, I think that we are in a difficult situation. I think that we have now reached, I'm hoping that we have reached the tipping point with the fact that we are going to be taken off the drip feed and the life support system and finally get the the weapons that we really need in order to end this war. And it really is a tribute to everybody, both in Ukraine as well as outside of Ukraine, who have really stood up for freedom.
That's wonderful, and that's so nice to hear. It's horrifying, and I'm curious, you know, from your perspective, it must be hard to retain optimism necessarily, but how does this end in your view?
Well, we don't have any choice. This is essentially a war of extermination. We have an enemy that is trying to wipe Ukrainians off the face of the earth. This is a genocidal terrorist attempt to take a country of 40 million people and basically rid it of the people that live there. So that really helps focus your mind, I have to tell you. And we have no choice. And we will fight, and we'll fight to the end. The situation now is that we have no electricity, we have intermittent electricity, we have intermittent heat. We've had 3 air raid warnings I got on my phone app today. We were attacked last week with hypersonic missiles going after electricity grids. Putin is at war with the Ukrainian people, and the horrific atrocities that have taken place in places like Bucha, Irpin, Mykolaiv, Izium. And you can go through them where women and children are being raped and murdered and tortured. I mean, we've just gone so far. We've had 13 million people displaced from their homes, 8 million of which live in the EU, 3 million have been deported into Russia, and 14,000 children have been kidnapped and are being put up for adoption with Russian families. I mean, this is horrific. And out of all of this, 90% of Ukrainians say, not 1 centimeter of land do we give them. We do not leave him on our soil because he will come back. And he will come back not just to take us, but to take EU countries, Poland, the Baltic states, and that's when American soldiers die. This is the deal of the century for NATO countries and the United States in particular. We do the fighting, we do the dying, you give us the weapons, and we defeat and weaken your enemy. And this is your enemy, because he says he's your enemy. He's out to destroy everything that we believe in and as people who love freedom and believe in freedom. And, I think that in NATO countries, the cost of supporting Ukraine is if you take the NATO countries together, 0.01% of GDP. For Americans, for the amount of aid that they've given Ukraine, it's $14 a month. And I don't think you're going to make a better investment, frankly, than that. So I think victory actually means, from my perspective, from President Zelensky's perspective, he says, total defeat of the Russian army in Ukraine, back to our 1991 borders, to regain our sovereignty, war crimes tribunals, and reparations. For me personally, that translates as my friends come home in one piece, and I go to Crimea this summer for a holiday.
Well, I hope you get that.
Thank you.
Can we talk to you, Peter, about your perspective? And hey, hard pivot. No, I want to hear from you as well about what you see for Ukraine's future. I know you've done a ton of kind of modeling and figuring out what the winds are saying. Can you tell us a little bit about where you think?
Well, let me start by saying I didn't hear anything over here that spooks me or I disagree with at all. But looking at it from the bigger picture, just to kind of underline what's at stake here. You guys remember when that 20-mile convoy of military vehicles in the first week of the war was coming down from Belarus to Kiev? And how on the day 4 of the war it stopped because they forgot fuel? And on day 7, all the soldiers walked back to Belarus because they also forgot food. That underlined for NATO that Russia has forgotten how to fight a war, not just from the Soviet times, but from the Tsarist times. They're relearning how to do everything from scratch. That's fact 1. Fact 2, the Russians feel that they cannot be physically secure unless they can block the territories that allow access to the heartland, They're facing a demographic collapse. They know if they don't expand militarily now, they won't be able to in the future. And those access points that they need, Ukraine isn't one of them. Ukraine is in the unfortunate position on being on the way to 2 of them. So from the Russian point of view, Ukraine is just a step. And when they are done with Ukraine, if they are successful, they will come for Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Bulgaria, and Romania, excuse me, NATO countries. So we know, if they win, that the next fight will be with us. But they don't know how to fight a conventional war any longer. So the defense estimates that I have seen suggest 1,000 to 1 casualty ratios. They're doing worse than the Iraqis did in '92. But they see this as a fight for their existential survival, and they are right. So there will be a nuclear exchange. Just to underline that, if Ukraine loses, we will lose cities. And so the opportunity cost here, to put it in your parlance, wow. Never before has there been an opportunity to leverage so little to get so much. Whether or not Ukraine can win, we're going to find out this year. It's been mud season. The Ukrainians can't fight a war of attrition. They don't have the numbers. They have to find a way to get a strategic advantage that allows them to go from the 2 to 3 to casualty ratio, 2 to 3 to 1, to something closer to 8 to 10. That's the only way Ukraine wins. They can't do that when they can't move, and the mud season has prevented them from moving. By the time we get to May, mud season will be over. We will probably have these main battle tanks in place, but for every battle tank that the West has committed to this point, the Russians are going to have another 5,000 men on the front. It's a classic Sparta versus Athens, and by the time we get to June, we're going to know which of those 2 strategies is going to be more successful. And then we will know who will win. We won't know when yet. I'm sorry, that summer vacation is probably not going to happen. You're going to be busy.
I booked my flight.
Yeah.
You're going to find a way. Well, it's amusing, if a little depressing, to hear the kind of risk reward. I love that you're putting it in that parlance. Can you, I mean, both of you think a lot about what this means for investors, for kind of the entire global supply chains and all of these industries that depend on it. So can you talk a little bit, Daniel, we'll start with you, with how investors should think about this, what the ripple effects are that investors should be thinking about?
Yeah, this is, I'm probably not going to say super popular things. Maybe I will, I don't know.
Just useful, doesn't have to be popular.
The conversations generally about Ukraine are actually conversations about Russia. Because nobody knows much about Ukraine. Nobody studied it, nobody was really interested, except for policy wonks. But I think that Ukraine right now is at the epicenter of global change. And we used to talk about the reforms that needed to take place in order to build a European Ukraine. I'm actually thinking now about a Ukrainian Europe. Because if Ukraine, which I never expected to have candidate member status, I never expected to see that in my lifetime, but now that's a reality, and we're going to have to push that. We are also right now de facto a NATO member. We are the eastern shield of NATO. So, people saying, like Spain or Germany saying, well, we can't give you our tanks because we need them to protect our eastern border. Look at a map, okay? So I think that this is really important because when Ukraine joins the EU, the center of gravity of the EU is going to change. You're going to have a Polish-Ukrainian axis, and that's going to have profound political implications, but it's also going to have profound economic implications because we're already integrated to a very large extent. I was, for 3 years, the head of Ukraine Invest, which was the Ukrainian government's foreign investment promotion agency, and there was no bigger thankless job in the Ukrainian government from 1916 to 2019. I couldn't even get a conversation with most investors because they couldn't find Ukraine on a map of Ukraine. I think that problem's solved. On the other hand, we had, since we signed the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, we had already integrated to such a large extent. We were already part of the European supply chain. But this is going to have global implications as well, because we're now going to, in my view, we're seeing the start of a bipolar world, where you're going to have the axis of evil, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. India, Brazil, and Indonesia are going to have to figure out which way they're going to go. And then you have the democracies. And this is really, I think, what Ukraine has done I hope, for a lot of Western democracies is reminded everybody how important principles are. There is a cost to doing business with tyrants and autocrats. And that's something that business and financial sector people need to understand. Your supply chains, a lot of your investment strategies you're gonna toss the manual because they're gonna change. We're gonna have new energy. I used to wonder, what are we gonna do with all the Soviet-era energy infrastructure? Well, Vladimir Putin took care of that. So we've now got to go back. We're not gonna rebuild these huge power plants. We're gonna go to green energy. We're gonna go to something that's more local, more mobile. That's gonna have an impact on Europe because we're gonna be the big experimental laboratory of how you rebuild a country of 40 million people from scratch. And this is gonna have global implications as well. And you're gonna either be part of the China-Russia axis or part of the American-led international democratic axis. And you know, that's maybe too stark a point, but I think that it bears thinking. I mean, the EU especially has been Putin's enabler for the last 10 years. We've been at war with Putin for 8 years now, 9 years now, since he invaded the Donbass. This is just the next iteration. During that time, the EU doubled down, especially Germany, doubled down on doing business with them, building Nord Stream 2, getting more, becoming more dependent on Russia than less dependent. All of that's gone out the window now. And I don't think, I mean, Peter knows much more about this than I do, but I don't see how you go back to doing business with an aggressive, terrorist, genocidal empire on your doorstep. And is that what you really want? So we may actually see what I call euphemistically the decolonization of Russia. If they are defeated in Ukraine, and they must be defeated in Ukraine, if there's ever going to be peace in Europe, and if they are defeated, that will create certain events inside Russia. Let's not get ourselves bent out of shape about, oh my God, we can't do that because somebody else is going to come into power. Guess what? You don't control anything that happens inside Russia, and we never have. And having we need to accept the fact that Russia may actually break apart. And we have to manage that process in a way that we take advantage of it as democracies, because our principles and our matter, they are the lifeblood of our societies.
I agree with the local picture. I don't agree with the global picture. So
I'm not surprised.
Yeah. For Ukraine to win, Russia doesn't just have to lose its military capacity in Ukraine. It has to lose its military capacity to project power at all. And that will lead to a political shift and maybe even a regime collapse within the Russian system. But even before we get there, how can I put this most clearly? Halliburton took a moral stance on the war. Anyone who wants to put money in or do business with Russia has to consider that you are now in an ethical bucket that is closer to Attila the Hun than Halliburton. You want to talk reputational risk? You know, you want to look under the hood and look at rule of law. You want to look at corruption. You want to look at efficiency. But you've got to make it clear that you're going to go places that Nazi Germany didn't. That's what you're going to be a part of if you want to play in that field. Because of that, other companies took their moral guidance from Halliburton. And we've seen a collapse in the capacity of Western techs and capital to get into the Russian space to maintain infrastructure. Their fertilizer industry, just to pick one, was built in the 1960s. It does not work without that foreign stuff. Most of the wells that were drilled in eastern Siberia, upwards of 95% of them, were not done by the Russians. So we are seeing a not so slow motion collapse of the entire Russian industrial space. And the only thing that will fix it is if folks like you throw their own personal money into projects that Halliburton wouldn't. I don't think that's very likely. But think about what that means. Not only are we going to be losing over the next several years in bits and pieces or all at once, it could go any number of directions, we're losing the world's second largest exporter of crude and refined product. We're losing the largest source of palladium, the second largest source of platinum group materials, the third largest source of copper, the third largest source of titanium and aluminum. You know, this has very real consequences. part of the economic story that you guys have all made mad money on is since 1990, when the world all unified in the the late globalization era, is we brought in huge chunks of territory that had not been economically metabolized. This is China, this is Brazil, this is Russia. That is now all unwinding with lightning speed. And anything that requires the base materials to function, we now have to get by without less. So if you want to support an industrial and economic trend, you have to now do it with less copper and nickel and the rest. And that means, among other things, that the green transition can't happen. We just don't have the stuff. We have never, in the history of humanity, doubled the industrial production of any material that we were already using within 10 years. And we now need 3 times as much copper and 4 times as much chromium and 10 times as much aluminum and 10 times as much lithium and 18 times as much graphite, and we're losing Russia, making that statistically impossible. Something will give here. So that's kind of the geopolitical basis. Should we go into demographics now? You were like all psyched about that earlier.
I love demographics.
All right.
I want to come back to this, though.
Yeah. Let's put a pin in it.
Okay, so think of a demographic structure like a pyramid. You've got lots of children at the bottom, very few retirees at top, and just mortality builds it up like that. When you've got a lot of folks under age 40, you've got a consumption-based system that is driven by what people are doing to build their homes and buy their cars. High inflation, high consumption tends to be high import as well. But as technology improves, as you industrialize and urbanize, your population structure turns into a chimney. And that's kind of the magic moment, because you've got a lot of people aged 20 to 45 who are consuming, and a lot of people aged 40 to 65 who are investing. A good balance of consumption and productive workers. And that is the moment that most of the world has been in between roughly 1980 and 2015. But as you keep aging, you eventually open up into an inverted pyramid. And you don't go back from that, because your birth rate has now been too low for 50 years. It's not that you're running out of children. That happened 30 years ago. You are now running out of adults. That's Germany. That's China. In 20 years, that'll be India. Most of the world's advanced economic systems have aged past the point of no return. We're going through a moment in the West and in the United States where the baby boomers are finally retiring. And we've thought about that from a fiscal point of view, and that's relevant. I don't want to try to talk anyone out of that. But have you ever thought of what it means for you? Because this is the world's single largest source of capital. And on average, the world's baby boomers retired in December. We're already past the tipping point. Not tipping point in terms of recovery. We passed that as a world 30, 40 years ago. I'm talking about the availability of capital at all. We've seen the cost of capital roughly triple in the last 2 years. We're going to see that again in the next year or two. That's baked into the pie. So we're entering a world where we've got a labor shortage because boomers retiring, a capital shortage because the boomers are changing their investment portfolio. And in most parts of the world, there's not a consumption base to maintain this concept we have called globalization. Because ultimately, trade is about someone buying something. If you don't have a lot of people aged 20 to 45, there's not a lot of that going on. Northeast Asia and Western Europe are where these trends are most advanced. But the parts of the world where they are advancing most quickly are Russia and Ukraine. So even if we can avoid a general nuclear exchange, even if the Ukrainians continue being the David to Russia's Goliath and actually take it down, we still need a fundamentally different economic model. And the European Union's not going to be part of that. Because remember, not only do the Germans have a starkly terminal demography, they have based their entire manufacturing system on an energy provider that can no longer provide energy. There's nothing about that system that survives this decade. And that's a very different geospatial and economic system of relationships that we, at the moment, have yet to invent a theory to frame, much less come up with some sort of industrial policy, much less come up with a financial way to play with that in a world with less finance.
Yeah.
No pressure.
Yes, please.
Can I jump in? Because, I don't even know where to start. There were so many important points in there. I think that If you want job security, you want your kids to have job security, tell them to become a compliance officer. Because this is going to be the safest job in the Western world for many, many years. Because the corollary, or the add-on, the complement to defeating Russia and to containing Russia is further sanctions. And so this Attila the Hun versus Halliburton, which I just think is a great analogy, is very apt. And I think that you saw the stampede out of Russia, which still hasn't finished, is because people are worried about the reputational risk. The sanctions are designed to create ambiguity, and business is always going to take the most conservative. So we need to continue sanctioning Russia so long as it is going to be prosecuting an aggressive military political posture. But this is creating these economic issues. And back to my theory about a Ukrainian Europe. We have enormous deposits of titanium, of lithium, of uranium, of a lot of the rare earth metals, never been developed because the Russians and the Soviets didn't need to do that. They felt safer developing their own deposits east of the Urals. Now all of that stuff can be up for grabs. That's going to be an opportunity. You folks are like my profession. You know, lawyers and financial people always will make money when there is turbulence, whether the market's going up or the market's going down. The worst thing is when nothing's happening, because then you don't know what to do. So in this new economic age, with taking all the factors that Peter just talked about as well, there is enormous opportunity here for you in this epicenter of global change. And I think that the mindset that certainly I'm thinking about for my own clients is you need to change the way you look at things. The old way of doing business is you're probably going to get left behind at some point. And so you have to look for new opportunities. There's no roadmap. Nobody wrote a manual on what's going to happen and how to behave going forward. But I think there's one last point that I want to make. And when I set up the unit, I was involved in setting up the unit in our community, in our region of the Territorial Defense Forces. I was inspired by a ragtag group. He talked about David and Goliath. A David and Goliath ragtag group of people who really wanted to fight tyranny and be free and develop and build something great. That was the 13 colonies. This was the founding fathers and the ragtag army, Revolutionary Army, that defeated the Goliath of their day and built the most phenomenal country in the world, and the most powerful country in the world, the most economically successful country in the world. And they did it because they believed in principles. Somewhat aspirational, still a work in progress, but those principles are fundamental, and they are the ones that are driving us. And that is the belief in freedom, the belief that people are allowed and have the right, the God-given right, to make their own choices and choose their own future. That there are things worth dying for. That it's not all like, oh my God, let's think to the other side, and et cetera. There are black and white. And, sometimes it's better to stand on, the Americans taught us this. It's better to stand on your feet and die a free man than to live on your knees a slave. And that's when people talk to us about negotiating a portion of our land, leaving them with parts of Ukraine, you're condemning the people in those areas
I don't think you need to worry about that
slavery and slaughter. No, but talking to financial people.
Yeah, I know, but back on September 1, the Germans shut off Nord Stream, just before we got blown up. But the Russians said flat out, your industrial base will collapse without this. By the way, the German industrial base is collapsing, so problem there. But they're like, you have a choice. We will turn this back on if you pull out of the pro-Ukraine coalition, and then you can remain modern, you just can't be Western. Or you can stick with the Ukrainians and you can be Western, but you will no longer be modern. The Germans made the decision to stick with the West in September. And so has there been hemming and hawing and normal German bitching? Yes. Democracies, they debate, maybe too long. But the point is, the hard decision in the West has already been made. So if there is going to be a Western failure in Ukraine, that's not the one I'm worried about.
I hope so. I pray you're right. My biggest fear is that we get thrown under the bus, but I think the bus has left the station.
I think Everyone I've spoken to in the defense ministries across NATO, when that column going for Kiev in the first week of the war, when that failed, everyone saw where this would go if Ukraine fell. So it might not be up for public discussion because it's a really dark conversation, like even by today's standards. But I think that has sunk in everywhere. I mean, think of it this way. Belgium. I apologize if you're from Belgium, but it's a useless country. It doesn't function. It doesn't have a national government worthy of the name. They got rid of all of their military equipment years ago. Freaking Belgium is trying to figure out how to buy tanks to send to Ukraine. And you know, if a country that is more obsessed with soccer and making sure their government fails this month has made that turn back to hard security being the issue, we're good.
The lines are clear.
At least mentally.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. This has been...
I would just like to once more thank everybody in this audience
Yes.
for the support that you've given us, and God bless you all.
It's beautiful. Thank y'all both. Okay.